The liberalism from the Orthodox perspective actually goes back to the papacy being the original Protestantism. And the reason that we say the papacy is original Protestantism is because the church abandoned the earlier synodal collegial structure that Rome now admits was the structure of the church of the first 1,000 years. If you read the Chieti document, as you've heard us point out many times, which is a Vatican-approved document on the Eastern model of the church, it admits that the Bishop of Rome did not have unilateral universal jurisdiction in the first millennium. That's a massive admission that Orthodox have complained about and critiqued for a millennium. So what happened, though, when Rome went in this direction? Well, it sort of necessarily fell into a kind of geopolitical world power structure. And it's not just the greed of the popes or something like that that led to that. That's part of it. But we also have to understand that there were historical factors, the fall of Rome to the barbarians in 400, 410, the rise of the prominence of the Bishop of Rome to also be a kind of a cultural hegemony at the time, the rise of the Papal States, the rise of these things, which contributed to the ever-growing worldly geopolitical prestige of the Bishop of Rome. Now, from the Orthodox perspective, we didn't suddenly decide to just break communion in 1054 or whenever, just willy-nilly. From our vantage point, the papacy, after many, many centuries, and I'll use the Gavin Ortlund term, began to have accretions when it came to their own view of themselves. So what was originally, from our perspective, you see this in the canons of Nicaea, for example, Canon 6, a first among equals relationship, or in the canons of Sardica, for example, a first among equals with an appellate structure where you could ask for a retrial. None of which is the Vatican I model of a unilateral, autocratic, Rome has spoken cases closed. Right? Roman Catholics just do not read their documents. They just assume what Roman Catholic dogmatic theology is from whatever gibbering, yapping pop apologists they hear on the internet, and they repeat it like a bunch of mina birds and chirping goobers, when in fact it says very clearly in their own documents that appeals in the appellate structure, this is the canons of Sardica that they like to appeal to, was not a unilateral Bishop of Rome decides what's right. In fact, the appellate structure allowed for the Bishop of Rome to, if he deemed it appropriate, order a retrial to be conducted in Rome. No, in that bishop's province. So you see, this is nothing like the claims of the Vatican I apologists. And that's why you'll see me referring to the documents that the Roman Catholics never refer to. They don't go to their documents. They give you this spill, this bad car salesman pitch, but they don't go to their documents. You'll notice there that it's not just Rome that had an appellate structure. You could actually appeal to other sees as well that were important, such as Constantinople. See that right there? Appeals regarding disciplinary matters were also made to Constantinople and to other sees. So it wasn't even a unilateral only to Rome thing. They were always treated in a what? Synodal way, not unilateral autocratic way. And what's the last line? The Bishop of Rome did not exercise canonical authority over the churches of the East in the first millennium. That is contrary to all of Vatican I's claims. So, from our perspective, what happens is that Rome doesn't overnight go bad. It wasn't there from the beginning. Over many centuries, the Roman See's view of itself grew into a position that was eventually untenable by the East. That's our position. Now, another really well done introductory book on this is Two Paths by Michael Welton. But if you go to the chapter that most concerns us today, and this is chapter 5, you'll note that Michael Welton's chapter 5 is about the Gregorian Revolution. And the deeper that you go into the Gregorian Revolution in this period, I've read several books just on this period. So this is not me just picking this. I'm telling you that this is an Orthodox book that is summarizing what you will find in the academic literature. And even Roman Catholic academic literature from Dvornik or Congar basically admits most of these points now. In the 11th century, in what's called the Gregorian Reform, or if you're Orthodox, the Gregorian Revolution. The papacy took on openly massive, explicit geopolitical world power. Now keep in mind, in the canons of Chalcedon, it is forbidden for clerics to also have a role in the civil state. And I have to talk very slow, because every time I talk to Roman Catholics about this, and they cannot understand this. When I talk about unum sanctum, they get lost. They don't understand what it is I'm saying. So I'm going to be very clear, hopefully. This is where it becomes a geopolitical secular power. So let's take the two powers model, church and state. The state pertains to the things of the body, to this life, to justice, to the death penalty, to war, etc. The church deals with things of the spirit, the soul, the inner man, right? So there's a body-soul relationship that's often used of the two powers idea, the temporal earthly power and the spiritual heavenly power. Due to the papal forgeries in part, and the claims of the Gregorian papacy, the argument began to be made that, especially in Dictatus Papae, as you know, because the Pope is the head of the church, that makes him also the head of the temporal bodily world as well. So he's the head of both church and state, and thus you must confess this doctrine of the Pope being also a world leader, a geopolitical world power, to be saved. That is unum sanctum. And the last paragraph of unum sanctum is about this issue. Not only must you confess the Pope as the head of the spiritual power, you must also confess the Pope as the head of all kings and emperors and a world emperor power to be saved. And if you don't, you are not in communion with the Roman Pontiff, and you cannot be saved. Clear as day. Now, unum sanctum is written by Boniface VIII in 1302. So this is actually a few centuries after Dictatus Papae. So between 1090, when this is first stated, as far as we know, in the papal registry, and then explicitly formulated and mandated by 1302, it's made abundantly clear that this is necessary for salvation. And remember, as we've shown in the debates and in the recent videos, this is repeated all the way up into the Syllabus of Errors and the Vatican I Pius IX documents. They repeat that you also still have to believe in the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop to be saved. It cannot go away. It's not a flexible doctrine. Now, post-Vatican II, this has all been explicitly discarded. In fact, the papacy has worked to de-Catholicize Christian states. And everybody knows about this. Even Benedict participated in this. So you essentially have the rejection of the medieval doctrine, the medieval Latin papal doctrine of the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop. But what also happens during this period of the Gregorian reforms that most people are not aware of unless you've read this history is that you have 164 years of Germanic control of the papacy, including 21 of 25 popes during this century, or 2 centuries almost, appointed by the German crown. Did you hear that? So it's preposterous and dishonest when Roman Catholics treat Orthodox as subservient to the state. We're Caesaropapists, we're Erastians. No. You had almost 2 centuries where literally German kings appointed 21 of the 25 popes. Pope Leo IX is the first pope to openly go into warfare, into battle. The first pope to personally go to war, to call for a standing army to go to war, to be conducted against the Normans, ending in disaster with him being taken prisoner. The spectacle of priests, bishops, monks, all bearing arms and swords, shedding blood, came as a shock to the Byzantines, because the Byzantines understood that that's not the role of the church. That's the role of the state. The Christian state has that significance, and that's the two-headed eagle. And now we have the church side of the two-headed eagle putting on the temporal crown. This is also the period when we first get holy monks that can fight, warrior monks. There have never been warrior monks prior to this, okay? There's a great chapter on this in another excellent book that I recommend, The Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy, 1071 to 1453 by Papadakis and Meyendorff. It's a great book. Excellent on particularly the Templars and the rise of the monastic knights who would fight. Now, are you thinking, let's think about this in a practical mode of thought here. We've never had this before. The papacy decides it's going to have warrior monks. Who do you think the warrior monks are loyal to and fight for? The papacy. So he's creating his own army. All of these new weird monastic orders pop up precisely in this Gregorian and post-Gregorian period. This is page 59 of the amazing magisterial Papadakis Meyendorff history text. And what propped this up, according to pages 52 and 53, was the prevalence of the forgeries, which George just wrote a 2-volume book about. Volume 2 is about the forgeries. You can get that at Uncut Mountain. Now, where did the Leo IX garner the idea, the belief, that he could go into war with warrior monks and monastics? Oh, Dictatus Papae. Did you know that? No. The place that he cited was actually, according to pages 48 and 49, Dictatus Papae. Now remember, I know Roman Catholics are ignorant of this. They have no idea what ancient canons taught, but in the ancient canons, even in Chalcedon, etc., you can't be a monk and go into war. You can't be a priest and fight. It doesn't mean that the state can't defend the church, but the church doesn't take up the role of the state, you goobers. Now, where do we get this idea from? Did you know this is actually a biblical principle? Outside of a few exceptions with David and Solomon, and I would argue that's due to their prophetic role, picturing and imaging Christ. Outside of those exceptions, what happens when Saul offers sacrifices at the altar? Oh, Samuel rebukes him. In other words, the king doesn't come in and do what the high priest does. The king isn't the Levite. In the New Testament, the king is a type of diakonos. Paul calls the ruler, the emperor, a diakonos who bears the sword for justice. That's the death penalty, you idiots. Then there's a twofold two-role power, which is symbolized by the Byzantine eagle. The church has a spiritual authority to pronounce excommunication and banning from the table, from the Eucharist, etc. And in some cases, the church might hand people over to the civil state, but the church doesn't grab a sword and lop people's heads off. Except in the medieval papal system, they do. That's where it goes. In other words, this alone, if you understand this and understand the attitude of the role of the church in the state that the Orthodox Catholic Church of the first millennium had towards itself, it limited itself to not have a secular role. In fact, on pages 44 and 45, this whole idea of a secular state comes out of the papacy attempting to take power in the state. If you had Christian rulers, there would be no need for this. And on page 38 and 39, they point out that the papacy originally rejected this idea of the Eastern canonical approach so that it could have standing armies and go to war. Now, let me make sure I didn't get this wrong. Let me state this right. From the outset, Leo IX was determined to make the papacy an instrument of spiritual and moral rejuvenation in Rome and throughout Europe. To this end, Leo journeyed to the central and south of Italy, but also to France and Germany and across the Alps 3 times. Nearly 4.5 years of his 5-year pontificate were in fact spent outside of Rome. The numerous regional reforming synods held during this period of lengthy sojourns often had as their target the traffic in ecclesiastical offices and unchaste clergy. So the motivation wasn't just power. They did want to reform the lax state of the clergy in the Roman jurisdiction. Their object was to rid the church of abuses by restoring canonical discipline. The need to reassert both the validity and the binding power of canon law for all clergy was repeatedly emphasized. However, this is not Eastern canon law, but papal law. Oh, well, that all sounds good, so where's the problem? Well, here we go. This is where this becomes problematic. The attempt was to originally decree canons against simony, sexual laxity amongst the clergy, sexual laxity in local synods and how they ruled, and many priests at this time had concubines. Many were suspended, deposed, and excommunicated. The object, in short, was to punish all the offenders, and even if the synods were not always successful, no one doubted that Leo IX and his team of like-minded assistants were serious in their reforms. However, after all, to say it once more, the papacy until then had no sense of itself as an international body that had responsibilities for the entire world beyond the Alps and for Christian Europe as a whole. As its confining history during the post-Carolinian age illustrates, Rome until this time had rarely interfered outside of Italy. Now, how is Vatican I true if that's the case? By contrast, in 1049, it was being extolled as the undisputed center of all of Latin Christendom, the supreme divinely ordained authority of the Church, universal. If anything, papal activism forced Europe to take notice. The Church of Rome was thus on the threshold of an entirely new age. Pope Leo, in fact, transformed them into an immediate principal counselor of advisors known as the cardinals. This is where we get the office of the cardinal, which there was no cardinals in the first millennium of Christianity, by the way. So, by the way, if you want to understand, like, the fact that this is a totally different church, just look at the cardinals, who Leo IX just creates, right? By decree in 1059, the cardinal bishops would in fact be honored with metropolitan authority and choose the election of a new pope. Now, Roman Catholics say, well, the pope can do whatever he wants, so who cares? Interesting. So the pope can do whatever he wants, who cares? Oh, but actually nowadays the pope's held by tradition. He can't do whatever. So it's not really clear exactly how the pope can do whatever he wants, but he's also not able to do whatever he wants. Oh, he's bound by tradition. This is also the period where the Roman Church universally begins to mandate celibacy for all the clergy, even though they had already waffled on Trollo's allowing for married clergy. This was the period when they began to enforce it. The first cardinal election was 1059. And by the way, I think I got it backwards. It's actually Leo IX who's first. He's Gregory VII before Gregory VII. So it's Leo IX that goes to war and has all the principles that Gregory VII then puts into Dictatus Papae. So I think I got that backwards. Part of the controversy, by the way, side note, that led to the rise of the authority on the part of the Bishop of Rome in terms of claims for himself was the controversy between Gregory VII and Henry III. And if I recall, this is the I'm going from memory, but I think he imprisoned the Pope, and then in response, the Pope got out and then made him like stand outside in the snow to repent or whatever. And so this is what led the Pope to say, aha, see, I have to be above the Pope, all the world rulers, or they will imprison me. So this is his rationale. So yeah, so it's Leo IX's beliefs that lead to Gregory VII's principles listed in Dictatus Papae, and that's covered on pages 48 and 49 of this book. And of course, after this is this period, by the way. Let's see. The first time the word Vicar of Christ is ever used is this period. And that's admitted by Congar. So this is page 50. No one had ever used this term Vicar of Christ, although I take that back. According to Papadakis, the term Vicar of Christ was actually used for the emperor. And then it becomes the title for that the Pope uses in the West. So when Roman Catholics use the phrase Vicar of Christ, you can point out to them, oh, you mean the same term that was used for the emperor prior to 1059? Yeah, when was it ever used prior to 1059 for the Roman bishop? By the end of the century, Pope Innocent III was already discarding the formula representative or vicar of Peter, and now he used the term Vicar of Christ. The text goes on to talk about the forgeries being key to this period, and it was actually the entire Eastern Church which was the basis for Dictatus Papae itself. Dictatus Papae is directed against the Eastern Church. Then we get the new weird monastic fighting orders, who are the agents that prop up the new papacy. Does that not make a lot of sense? We get Bernard of Clairvaux, we get the Templars, we get the Hospitallers, the papal assassins of this period. And all is trash. Notice how they don't even care that the very rise of a papacy with a sword undercuts the notion of a Christian state. They don't even realize that this undoes the very thing that they think is based in trad, a Christian state, because it's no longer a duty and a role of a Christian king or emperor. It's now the role of the head of the church, the spiritual power. So it's confusing the spheres of authority and power. Again, Leo the Ninth, first pope to personally go to war. This is a new revolutionary order. And in fact, it is these claims and reforms, in part, that spawn the Protestant Reformation. So far from Roman Catholics blaming everybody else for this, and Luther and this and that, they have only to blame themselves for the nonsense of Dictatus Papae, Leo the Ninth, and warrior monks. Now, to be precise in terms of this triple crown, as you know, the papal tiara or triple crown was supposed to signify the triplicity of authority that the Pope has, right? In heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and that he's above all the state rulers as well. John Paul I was the first pope to reject receiving the papal tiara. Again, showing you that the Vatican II popes have rejected the notion of the Christian state. That's why Vatican II is nothing about the Christian state and all about freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of private interpretation, all that stuff. Now, I mean, when I say private interpretation, I'm talking about the right of the conscience of the individual and all that, which prior to that is condemned many times over in many papal documents. When Leo the Ninth was challenged on why he could go to war and why he could have vast land holdings, guess what he cited as his basis? You got it, the donation of Constantine, the infamous, universally admitted forgery. Now, it's funny too that after this period is the first discussion of the Pape. Here's an interesting question that you never hear the Roman Catholics raise: when is the first mention of infallibility for the Bishop of Rome? Does anybody know? It's explicit, like an explicit reference to the infallibility of the Bishop of Rome. Now, if this was always the teaching of the church, presumably it would have been in the first 1,000 years. But no, it turns out there's not a mention of this in the first 1,000 years. Well, when was the first mention of papal infallibility specifically? Historian Brian Tierney has shown that papal infallibility itself did not develop slowly, but was created by members of the Franciscan order at the end of the 13th century because it suited their convenience to invent this doctrine. Pope John the 22nd attacked their doctrine of evangelical poverty, and in 1324, John the 22nd actually condemned papal infallibility as a novelty. He also got in trouble for other doctrines, and he's one of the popes that Roman Catholics will argue over as to whether he actually taught heresy. Anyway, regardless, John the 22nd was, he says, the Franciscan leaders defended the cherished papal bull on the grounds that it was irreformable, and its very irreformability logically presupposed papal infallibility. John the 22nd, however, was not interested in personal papal infallibility. For him, infallibility would place him in a straitjacket, limiting his powers and thus limiting the reigning pontiff by the infallible declaration of every predecessor. March of 1322, John the 22nd issued the bull Extravagantes, in which he maintained the right of a reigning pope's right to annul any of the decrees and judgments of his predecessors. So this is fascinating because John the 20th, think about how crazy this is. John the 22nd doesn't want to admit papal infallibility because the Franciscans are saying there has to be papal infallibility because that would make John the 22nd bound by his predecessors. John the 22nd is saying, I am not bound by my predecessors, and thus there isn't papal infallibility because I can thus annul or create judgments against or for my predecessors. This is so goofy. In 1324, he issues another bull called Quia Quorundum, in which he contemptuously proclaims that papal irreformability and infallibility is a pernicious audacity that the father of lies has led the Franciscans to declare. Now, here's a great quote from normie papal apologists, just to show you how dishonest and ignorant they are. This is from, who is this? Radio Replies by Leslie Rumble and Charles Carty, Roman Catholic writers. This is what they say. Before the definition of papal infallibility in 1870, the popes did not know that they were infallible with the same clarity as later popes, but they were infallible. So papal infallibility was there, just nobody knew about it. But they still had it. It was there, but they didn't even know. This thing is how stupid this position is. This is actual Roman Catholic apology. This is 10 books, papal apologetics. I mean, talk about smoke and mirrors and it's just crazy, dude. It's a crazy fun house. Well, you may be familiar with this period because this is also when we get the Great Schism of the West. And why would we even have the Great Schism of the West if it were not the papacy directly wrapped up in geopolitical power? Because we get 3 claimants to the See of Rome. The See of Rome gets solved in terms of its claimant through, guess what? An ecumenical council. So imagine trying to think that the Council of Constance, which decided which pope would be the pope, but at the same time, according to Vatican I, your dogma is that no pope is above a council. No councils are spirit of popes. In fact, when anti-pope John resigned and the Council of Constance said that it would be Pope Martin that would be chosen as the legitimate pope, Pope Martin wrote Inter Cunctas, which said that no one is superior to an ecumenical council of the church, which is the head of the church. That's Inter Cunctas of Pope Martin. It's not infallible, don't accept it. Yeah, it's only infallible when you agree with it, and when the popes do something wrong or contradict, suddenly it's not infallible, which means essentially that it's a worthless system. It's like a Protestant saying, the verse means what I want it to mean when I like it, and if you cite a verse against me, it doesn't mean that. So Roman Catholics are Protestant. I suppose they're the first Protestants. Now, in terms of religious liberty, we already listed in multiple live streams all the condemnations of religious liberty, and yet it is the most important thing, one of the most important things throughout Vatican II. In fact, there's an entire document on how crucial religious liberty is, even though it was condemned, and even though, if you go back to the Fourth Lateran Council, anyone who would not exterminate heretics was excommunicated. So kings at the Fourth Lateran Council who will not exterminate heretics are excommunicated. Fast forward to Vatican II in 1965. Religious liberty and freedom of conscience and freedom of worship are fundamental human rights guaranteed everywhere to everyone at all times. I mean, this is a joke. This thing is actually a ridiculous joke. And they just can't accept it. It's so earth-shattering and frightening that they can't accept that. So that's the background of the geopolitical situation that the papacy found itself in throughout these centuries. And of course, I'm sure we all know about the Renaissance papacy with the Medicis and all that kind of stuff, and Alexander VI. And if you've ever watched Jeremy Irons playing the Borgias, that's actually a good series. You get another insight into just the insane, preposterous levels of like worldliness during that period, which it's not a moral critique. I understand that plenty of Orthodox bishops throughout the world have been luxurious and corrupt and all that. So the argument here is not about moral corruption or impeccability. The argument is about a doctrinal change, an ecclesiastical change in the structure of the church and in the doctrines of the church, to say that the Pope can now have standing armies, go to war, excommunicate entire nations when their kings don't go to war for them to fill the papal coffers. And it's these things, in part, that led to the Reformation. That doesn't mean the Reformation doctrines are good, but the critiques of the Reformers are not without substantial basis. That's the point.